There's a photograph taken in the spring of 1964, during the height of Beatlemania, somewhere backstage in London. Paul McCartney and George Harrison are sitting side by side, not performing, not posing for the cameras, just talking. Two young men from Liverpool, leaning close, sharing some private joke the world will never know. For a moment, the screaming crowds don't exist. The record executives don't exist. They're just two friends who once rode the same bus to school, who once crouched over the same guitar chords in a cramped Liverpool bedroom, who built something together that the world had never seen before and has never seen since. Paul McCartney has spent over 2 decades living in the shadow of that friendship. For years, he said very little about George publicly. The wounds were too complicated, tangled up in ego, in creative rivalry, in the particular grief that comes when someone dies before you settle everything between you. But in recent years, something has shifted. Paul has begun to speak. Slowly, carefully, painfully. And what he has said has opened a window into one of the most complex relationships in the history of popular music. This is the story of what Paul McCartney finally admitted about George Harrison, and what it reveals about the bond they shared, the years they lost, and the love that outlasted everything. To understand what Paul has said about George in his later years, you first have to understand where it all began. Because Paul never stops going back to Liverpool when he talks about George. It is always Liverpool. It is always the bus. In 2021, Paul McCartney sat for an extraordinary 6-hour conversation with journalist and author Paul du Noyer, portions of which were later published. He spoke at length about seeing George Harrison for the first time on the number 86 bus route that connected their neighborhoods in South Liverpool. Paul was about 15. George was a year younger, small for his age, dark-eyed, with a guitar case that immediately drew Paul's attention. They got to talking about music. Then they got to talking about nothing. Then they kept talking, every day, on that bus, until the conversations were more important than the destination. What Paul has described in multiple interviews over the years is not simply the beginning of a band. It is the beginning of something rarer, a friendship built on music before fame existed to corrupt it. In a 2015 interview with NPR, Paul recalled teaching George guitar chords during those bus rides, specifically the chord for 20 Flight Rock, the Eddie Cochran song that Paul had famously used to audition for John Lennon's skiffle group The Quarrymen in 1957. Paul was generous with what he knew. George was hungry to learn. That dynamic, the older boy who knew more, the younger boy who absorbed everything and quietly exceeded expectations, would define their relationship for the rest of their lives. Paul has since admitted, publicly and with visible remorse, that he never entirely stopped seeing George through the lens of that early dynamic. He kept seeing his younger student, long after George had become one of the most original musical minds of the 20th century. Paul would sometimes still see the boy on the bus. That failure of perception would cost him dearly. Success transforms every relationship. In the case of Paul and George, it did something more surgical. It created a hierarchy, and then it calcified it. By the early 1960s, the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership had become the engine of the Beatles. John and Paul wrote the hits. George was the lead guitarist. That distinction, which might have seemed practical and unremarkable in 1963, became a source of deepening pain for George as the decade wore on, and his own songwriting voice grew stronger and more distinctive. Paul has spoken about this with increasing candor in his post-2000 interviews. In his 2021 biography, The Lyrics, a book-length memoir structured around his songwriting catalog and assembled with poet Paul Muldoon, Paul addresses George's frustration directly. He acknowledges that the culture inside the Beatles was not always hospitable to George's compositions. Sessions for albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver occasionally saw George's songs treated as lower priority. Paul does not fully excuse himself in this account. He says plainly that the Lennon-McCartney dominance made it hard for George to get his songs on. That admission is not small. For decades, Paul tended to discuss the Beatles' internal tensions in careful, diplomatic language. The shift toward genuine self-examination, acknowledging his own role in making George feel diminished, reflects how much his perspective has changed since George's death in 2001. The making of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967 is a recurring flashpoint in Paul's reflections on George. Paul has described Sgt. Pepper as one of the creative achievements he is most proud of, a project he essentially drove forward as a concept. But he has also acknowledged, in interviews with the BBC and others over the years, that George found the experience alienating. George's one composition on the album, Within You Without You, was a genuinely groundbreaking piece of work, a meditation on Indian classical music and Vedic philosophy that sounds like nothing else in the Beatles' catalog. But it stood alone on side 2, bracketed by Paul's music hall numbers and John's psychedelic word games. George reportedly felt it was tolerated rather than embraced. Paul has said, quietly, that he understands why George felt that way. The events of January 1969 are perhaps the most painful chapter in Paul and George's story, and they are the chapter Paul has returned to most often in recent years with something approaching genuine contrition. The Get Back sessions, filmed for what would become the Let It Be documentary, and, decades later, Peter Jackson's remarkable 2021 restoration Get Back, captured the Beatles in a state of advanced internal collapse. The footage shows Paul directing, suggesting, pushing. It shows George, initially patient, then increasingly quiet, then finally absent. On January 10, 1969, George Harrison walked out of the rehearsals at Twickenham Film Studios. He did not come back for 12 days. When Peter Jackson's Get Back was released, Paul watched himself on screen for the first time since those sessions. What he saw clearly disturbed him. In interviews following the film's release, Paul was unusually raw. He told journalists that watching himself in the footage was sometimes difficult, that he could see himself being controlling, being directive in ways that he had not fully recognized at the time. He said it looked, at moments, as though he was treating the other Beatles like a schoolteacher treats pupils. He mentioned George specifically. He admitted that he had probably pushed too hard. This was new. This was Paul McCartney doing something he had rarely done in public, looking at his own behavior and calling it what it was. Paul has also spoken in interviews about a particular exchange with George during that period, a conversation that became heated, in which Paul kept offering alternative ways for George to play a guitar part, and George told him, with barely controlled fury, that he would play it however Paul liked or not play it at all. Paul has said, in retrospect, that he hears that exchange differently now than he did then. He heard stubbornness at the time. He hears pain now. After the Beatles disbanded in 1970, and after the lawsuits and the public bitterness that followed, Paul and George's friendship did not so much end as hollow out. They were civil, occasionally warm, but the deep ease of the bus ride years was gone. George's 1970 triple album All Things Must Pass, released to enormous critical acclaim and commercial success, contained Wah Wah, a song George wrote on the day he quit those January 1969 sessions. The title was slang for a splitting headache. Paul knew and knows that he was part of what gave George that headache. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Paul and George maintained what could most generously be called a distant peace. They appeared at occasional public events together. They were polite, but there were long stretches of silence, and beneath the silence was something unresolved. George gave interviews in the 1970s in which he said things that Paul clearly found hurtful. George suggested that Paul was domineering by nature, that being in a band with him required a kind of surrender that George had eventually been unable to accept. He said, in one widely quoted interview, that he would sooner be in a band with John Lennon than with Paul, which carried the obvious implication that he would not particularly want to be in one with Paul at all. Paul, to his credit, has not in recent years responded to those comments with defensiveness. He has instead tried to place them in context. In his conversations with journalist Paul Du Noyer and others, he has said that George was expressing something real, that the frustration behind those words was legitimate, even if the words themselves stung. He has said that he understands, looking back, why George felt the need to say them. Paul has also spoken about what he did not say to George while George was alive, the things he assumed could wait, the conversations he assumed there would be time for. He has said that he regrets not having more direct conversations with George about the Beatle years, about the resentments that accumulated, about what they meant to each other beneath all of it. George was diagnosed with throat cancer in 1997. After surgery, and a period of recovery. The cancer returned in other forms. In 1999, a man named Michael Abram broke into George's home at Friar Park in Henley-on-Thames and stabbed him multiple times. George survived, but he was weakened. Paul visited. The visits were gentle, careful. Two men navigating toward each other across years of complicated history, running out of time to complete the journey. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, at a private residence in Los Angeles. He was 58 years old. His ashes were later scattered in the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India, in accordance with his Hindu faith. A final statement of the spiritual convictions that had shaped the second half of his life. Paul McCartney's public statement on the day of George's death was brief and careful. He was a great friend and a wonderfully gifted man. He brought a great sense of love and humor to everything he did. It was the language of grief at the beginning, when you don't yet know what to say. In the years since, Paul has said much more. He has spoken repeatedly about visiting George at a hospital in New York in the weeks before his death. In multiple interviews, including a 2015 appearance on Howard Stern's radio program and a 2018 conversation with Rolling Stone, Paul described sitting at George's bedside for hours, the two of them talking about nothing in particular, old stories, shared memories, things that made them laugh. He said that at some point they held hands. He said it felt entirely natural, though he acknowledged with a rueful smile that two men from Liverpool in the 1950s were not exactly trained in open expressions of affection. He said it felt like something that should have happened earlier and more often. He called George his baby brother. That phrase, baby brother, appears across multiple interviews, always delivered with the same quiet weight. It is the phrase Paul reaches for when he is being most honest. Not bandmate, not colleague, not even friend, brother. Paul has also spoken about the specific grief of losing someone with whom you had unfinished business. He told The New Yorker in 2021 that one of the hardest things about George's death was that it closed the possibility of resolution, that there were things he had expected to eventually get around to saying, and now he could not say them. He did not specify what those things were. He did not need to. The shape of the absence was clear enough. In recent years, as Paul has moved through his late 70s and into his 80s, his reflections on George have taken on a quality that can only be described as a reckoning. He is no longer managing the narrative. He is living inside it. In the lyrics, Paul writes about George's songwriting with an admiration that is both genuine and tinged with the particular ache of recognition delayed too long. He writes about something. The song George wrote during the White Album and Abbey Road period, which Frank Sinatra famously called the greatest love song ever written, as evidence of a talent that Paul now believes he undervalued in real time. He writes about Here Comes the Sun, composed by George one morning in the garden of Eric Clapton's house to escape the suffocating atmosphere of Apple Corps business meetings, as one of the most purely beautiful songs in the Beatles catalog. Paul does not hedge these assessments. He offers them as what they are. Overdue acknowledgments from a man who once had the power to open more doors for his friend and did not always use it. Paul has also spoken, in interviews following the release of Peter Jackson's Get Back, about the experience of hearing George's guitar playing again in full fidelity after 50 years. He said it was like hearing George speak. He said that the footage made George feel present in a way that photographs cannot quite achieve, that watching George move, hearing his particular tone and timing, brought back the living person in a way that was both comforting and heartbreaking. Paul has said that he thinks about George often. He has described the fir tree that George gave him, planted near the gate of Paul's farm in Sussex. Every time he passes it, he says hello. He says, "Hi, George." He has told this story in interviews multiple times, and each time it lands the same way, as the most private, human, unshow business thing a man of his stature could possibly admit to doing. Talking to a tree, keeping the conversation going the only way left available to him. The relationship between Paul McCartney and George Harrison was never simple, and Paul's reckoning with it has not been simple either. It has been slow and honest, and sometimes painful to listen to, in the way that genuine honesty usually is. What Paul has finally said, across years of interviews and one extraordinary book, amounts to this: George was extraordinary, and I did not always treat him that way, and I live with that, and I love him anyway, and the love was always there underneath everything, even when everything else was difficult. George Harrison was not simply the quiet Beatle, or the spiritual Beatle, or the third Beatle, or any of the diminishing labels the world attached to him during his lifetime. He was the man who wrote something, and here comes the sun, and while my guitar gently weeps. He was the man who brought Indian classical music into